Now suddenly, with Andrea Stewart-Cousins, this stuff is moving forward. Just sort of an avalanche of legislation was able to move forward that would not have moved forward, with a Republican state Senate or with a Republican IDC.
What does it take to get a more in-depth look into the week's top local news story? The Debrief brings you inside for a one-on-one conversation with our reporters every week, right here, right now. The Debrief.
Brought to you by Hackensack Meridian Health. Visit our partner site, NBCNewYork.com/healthyou, to help you on your health journey. Hackensack Meridian Health. Life years ahead.
Not everyone gets to follow the comings and goings and developments in Albany, but there are some new laws taking effect in the new year. So we spotted an article by Will Bredderman from Crain's, New York, which kind of breaks down some of the highlights for us. And we asked him to come to the Debrief podcast because that's what we do. Will, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Before we get to the specifics, Will, I know you cover politics for Crain's. And talk to me a little bit more about a situation where we have a Democratic governor, a Democratic Senate, Democratic Assembly. We hadn't had that in prior administrations, and how that maybe have shaped the activities up in Albany.
It's been about 10 years since we had a Democratic Senate, and frankly, it's been much longer than that since we had a functional, working
Right, exactly.
Democratic state Senate. So that's a massive change. Really, what you've seen is in the past there was some amount of triangulation went on. The Democratic Assembly put up bills, then they sort of wound up being sort of mediated through the Republican state Senate and the governor. Now, what we found for the first time this past year, particularly around issues like the rent reforms, but other issues as well, you found a sort of an alliance of the Democratic Assembly with the Democratic State Senate, and Governor Cuomo was not able to wield as much influence, and he sort of wound up having to sign some things perhaps he might not have loved to sign, or perhaps would have been hesitant to sign under other circumstances. So that's really been the big difference.
We used to talk, Will, about the three men in a room, literally talking about the
Right.
governor and the Senate president and the House Speaker. Well, now we have Andrea Stewart-Cousins as Senate, so
Right.
we know it's not three men in a room.
Right.
But also that dynamic just doesn't seem to be like it used to.
Well, sure. I mean, there was sort of a situation. I mean, the governor was always the strongest player
Right.
in Albany, particularly Andrew Cuomo, because he was very close to the Independent Democratic Conference in the state Senate that had a power sharing agreement between 2012 and 2018 with the Republicans, and of course
Would vote their way often.
Yeah, so basically that what really more than anything else, that kept bills that the Assembly passed and that the mainstream Democratic Conference in the Senate wanted to pass from ever getting to the floor. That's the power of the majority, right? That's the power of the majority leader. You control what gets to the floor, and if it doesn't get to it doesn't matter what bill you put your name on, doesn't matter how many co-sponsors you got. If it does not get to the floor, it doesn't go anywhere, and that's the big difference. Now suddenly, with Andrea Stewart-Cousins, this stuff is moving forward. Just sort of an avalanche of legislation was able to move forward that would not have moved forward. With a Republican state Senate or with a Republican IDC state Senate. And, so the dynamic is the governor is relatively disempowered when you have the Assembly Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader on the same page, pushing the same bills, the same agenda. That has been really the most radical shift in the dynamic in Albany.
All right, so that's good insight as we look at some of the things you've highlighted in your article, some of the things that our listeners and our viewers here on YouTube can expect in the new year. One of the big changes, and we've talked about it here on the podcast and in our newscast, is the change in cash bail. Take us through it.
Sure. Effectively, beginning in January, there will not be cash bail for misdemeanors and for nonviolent felonies, with some exceptions, carves out around sex offenses, domestic violence, that sort of thing, witness tampering, conspiracy to commit murder. So this could really, some people are saying, could set free as much as 40% of the city's pretrial detention population. Of course, this coincides at the same time with the city moving to close Rikers Island. it's certainly accelerating some of the mayor's timelines around sort of moving people out of detention. So this is going to be radically different for that industry. On the other hand, there has been some findings, like by Comptroller Stringer, that in fact that if you're a business owner, and our audience at Crain's is predominantly people in the business sector, that may work out for you, because frankly the finding of the comptroller was that having so many people unable to make bail, often for minor offenses, tragically in the case, for example, of Khalif Browder, somebody accused of stealing a backpack that he was later on acquitted of, and stuck in detention for these long periods of waiting because they cannot pay bail. That is a drag on economic productivity. That is the comptroller's argument. Certainly if you are, for example, somebody who's running a business and for whatever reason, unfortunately, one of your employees is sort of picked up, cannot make bail, that affects your entire business model. So, I mean, there may be a net economic benefit to this on the whole. Now, we have to see a lot of people who are skeptical are worried that people who are could be potentially dangerous could be allowed back onto the streets.
We've heard that from police commissioners and
absolutely
law enforcement.
Law enforcement. I believe the Westchester District Attorney has been very loud on this position. That has not really borne out in other jurisdictions that have sort of followed this policy. Of course, in New York City, everything's a bit different. We, of course, have a much greater density of people. So the people who are going to be most affected in the short term are bail bondsmen.
Right.
And for everybody else, there may be in terms purely economically, a net benefit.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's take a look at some of the others. Plastic bag ban. I guess this will start on March 1st, but listeners and those watching should be aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, you need to start bringing a reusable bag, or if you're a store owner, you need to start stocking up on reusable bags. Now, there is a carve-out for people who are using public assistance to buy their groceries.
Gotcha.
It's not clothing bags. It's not the bags that you put your vegetables
and some
your
municipalities have this already.
Yeah, I believe Suffolk County definitely has. New York City repeatedly tried to put it into effect and got sort of preempted by the state.
Right.
Again, seeing the changing dynamics.
Statewide on March 1st.
Statewide March 1st, and in New York City in particular, there will be a surcharge, 5-cent surcharge on paper bags as well. So you've got you're gonna need to, like I said, bring that tote bag or buy one from your store and be expecting to carry a reusable bag.
Another one that people may or may not know about is marijuana testing and employers.
Right. So beginning in May, under this is a city statute, businesses, government agencies, nonprofits, for the most part, will no longer be able to say, if you want to work here, you want to come in for an application, well, you've got to take a marijuana test. Now, there's carve-outs for this because there were concerns about danger, construction workers, commercial drivers,
certain healthcare and childcare.
Childcare, because yes, they didn't. There was a concern that these people could be potentially under the influence and endangering others. And also, I believe if you have a federal contract that says you must submit your employees to a drug test, they also are carved out of it. But otherwise, you just simply can no longer screen your employees for marijuana use, which tends to linger in the system for about 30 days, I believe.
What changed with discrimination and harassment? Albany passing a number of reforms, you say, to make it easier.
Oh, yeah. Well, for a long time, the standard in the human rights law around harassment and discrimination was that it was had to be severe and pervasive. That was the standard that you had to sort of build up to. And you also had to illustrate that, for example, your boss, if you were claiming harassment or discrimination by your boss, the boss could not say, well, I treated that guy over there just as badly. That is no longer a defense that they can sort of take shelter in, nor can they take shelter in these claim that they attempted to correct these things and that, I set up a program to correct this and the employee failed to avail themselves of this system that I created. So that's that means that that it's going to be much easier for an employee to sue their employer for discrimination and harassment, and that means that the onus is on employers to make sure they have their employees, really, because if your employee, your manager, is harassing one of his employees or his or her employees, and that employee complains about it, it falls back on the employer for creating that hostile work environment.
And want to point out also the statute of limitations for sexual harassment claims will stretch from 1 year to 3 years starting in August. So that's something we should take note of.
Absolutely.
This seems a little less impactful on a number of us, but zoned carding you included.
Yeah, zoned carding has been this massive fight in the city council going for a number of years. There was a sort of sense that the sanitation industry in New York City has been sort of the Wild West for generations. You have, effectively, if you're a private operator, private business, you don't rely on the Department of Sanitation to pick up your trash. You hire a carter, a private carter. For a number of years, these carting companies were controlled by the mafia. That was well known. That's less of a problem than it was then. The mafia is nowhere near as dominant as it used to be. But you still had cases. There was a particularly tragic case, I believe, in the Bronx. Sanitation worker was killed on the job. You have you have issues with injuries. You have also the fact that these trucks are driving the dead of night, making sort of large, circuitous routes, often not obeying the traffic laws. The idea was that a zoned carding system would be more orderly. It creates effectively a franchise. You slice the city up into 20 different zones. There are 60. Each zone can have up to 3 carters. Okay. And basically, these companies are going to have to bid to sort of service that area. And that is believed that will sort of reduce, there's some other provisions in there that are designed to sort of prop up health and safety standards, but it's just also you're going to sort of impose a sort of a order and rationality on the way that these carding companies function.
Gotcha. So a little bit more in the weeds for most, but important, especially when it comes to oversight. And we're still a ways away from a mayoral election, but we would expect it start to heat up and things taking shape as 2020 unfolds.
Right, and you're going to see a certain sort of race to get the endorsements from various unions, which are able to sort of run, not just get their members to the polls, but also to pay for what they call independent expenditures, or IEs, which effectively means you might get a mailer or a phone call, or somebody might come to your door, and that person isn't being paid by the campaign of this, of Corey Johnson or Scott Stringer or Ruben Diaz Jr. or Eric Adams, all these people who want to be mayor. Right. That person was paid for by a union, or in some cases it could also be by another private interest group. But that's going to be one of the real contests, is who's going to secure these sort of union endorsements that will, like I said, sort of allow them to mobilize voters and sort of get their name, their literature out there.
Will Bredderman, man, you made us smarter this time.
All right.
We're probably going to have you back, man.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
That's what's coming in 2020. I'm your host, David Ushery, coming to you from our busy newsroom at 30 Rock. I want to thank our producer, Jesse Edwards, and Ben Berkowitz from the NBC New York Digital team. Happy New Year. We'll check you next time on
Happy holidays.
Thank you for watching this video from NBC4 New York. You can subscribe by tapping the button below me, and on the left you can see our latest updates, investigations, and digital exclusives. We'll see you next time.